Greetings everyone, Banditex here. We're back for another year of SonicTember, this time taking a look at the remaining games from the Classic Era of the series. Sorry to those that were looking forward to a Sonic Adventure review this year, but I'm just not ready for that yet. You see, there was a pretty big gap between releases of Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Sonic Adventure. And this is because Sonic Team wasn't really focused on Sonic games at this point, as they were busy focusing on other games like Nights into Dreams. Not only that, but the game industry was going through a major shift. 2D games were out and 3D games were in, and Sonic needed to make that jump, as did Sega. Sega of America wanted to make an upgrade to the Sega Genesis to extend that console's lifespan, while Sega of Japan wanted an all-new console. And this is partially what killed Sonic's momentum at this time. The Sega 32X was yet another add-on to the Sega Genesis to increase the lifespan and power of the console, similar to the Sega CD, yet it flopped even harder. The Sega Saturn was the better route to go in comparison, but the system was notoriously difficult to develop games for, let alone new 3D titles. What this all meant was that Sonic's next big 3D game would just have to wait. There was one in development for the Saturn called Sonic Extreme, but the game was cancelled after many issues during development. You can find more info online. I'm not doing that here. With that said, Sonic was not dead. Far from it, as there were many games made to help fill the gap. Whether or not they're good, we'll see soon. This year's gimmick is spin-off titles. We've got racing games, games featuring other characters, and more. However, before we get into those, we're going to start with standard Sonic platformers, these being games where Sonic is the main character and are more or less similar to the Genesis games. With one exception, these games that we're looking at today all essentially follow the standard Sonic formula. Our first game is Sonic Triple Trouble, which was a sequel to Sonic Chaos, which was a game released on the Sega Game Gear and Sega Master System, and once again developed by Aspect. Now let me just say that I have not been a big fan of their work so far. I thought Sonic 2 was just weak overall and Chaos to be incredibly mediocre. So already I have suspicions of this game, but at the same time, third time's the charm. Maybe they're ready to make a good Game Gear game. I mean, they kinda had to this time, since this game was only on the Game Gear, with no official Master System port existing. Speaking of the Master System, I'm not going to be looking at any more games on the Master System this year, as I feel like there's not really a whole lot of differences between that console and the Game Gear. Besides, the Master System died in my country just about after Sonic 1 came out anyway, so I'd rather not stall and just kind of get through all these. We've got a lot of stuff to cover this year. Triple Trouble is once again about how Eggman stole a Chaos Emerald, but now he has some more help to keep him in the lead. Knuckles the Echidna is once again tricked by Eggman into helping him. Not only that, but we have a new villain looking for the emeralds too, Fang the Sniper or Knack the Weasel. I'm going to keep calling him Fang. Not only do I think the name is cooler, but that was his Japanese name, just like how Eggman was his Japanese name. Also, Fang isn't a weasel. He's half wolf and half jerboa, which, by the way, the latter look like this when they're babies. So the game is once again about Sonic and Tails working together to round up the remaining 5 Chaos Emeralds and get the 6th one back from Eggman. Yeah, just like Chaos, there's only 6 emeralds. Triple Trouble is your standard classic Sonic romp. You have to get to the end of the stage, there's rings to collect for lives and to act as a buffer between you and hazards, and you got your springs and loops as well. Just like Chaos, you can choose between playing as either Sonic or Tails. Both characters go through the same paths and can perform the spin dash once again. By pressing up and either jump button, Sonic will perform the super peel out once again, though he's invincible for a brief period as indicated by the little glitter effect. Tails doesn't have this move, but instead flies. The move itself feels much better than it did in Chaos, but not quite as satisfying as it was in Sonic 3. Still though, an improvement is an improvement. One new trick both characters have is the ability to curl up into a ball after bouncing off a spring. The effect is brief, but this can be used to protect both characters, hit a monitor, or just get a little extra hang time. It's actually pretty fun to play around with, and I kind of wish this idea stuck. Tails can even do this extra little flying hop after bouncing off of springs by holding up and pressing jump multiple times, which can actually be pretty fun. Like in Chaos, we have some extra power-up monitors to use. There aren't that many, so I won't spend much time on them here, but you have your vanilla speed shoes and invincibility, the returning spring shoes and rocket boots, and now Tails has a super flight monitor and Sonic gets a snowboard. Honestly, I have little to complain or compliment with these. Tidal Plant does have 2 separate power-ups for each character. Sonic gets boots that let him dart around the water, and Tails gets a freaking submarine that shoots projectiles while allowing him to breathe underwater. Which feels so out of place, yet it manages to be pretty freaking cool. Apart from the spring tricks and monitors, Triple Trouble doesn't have too much to call its own. The levels are all somewhat interesting this time around in their theming and gimmicks, but still aren't super exciting either. They tend to lean on the shorter side, but I still find the levels pretty enjoyable for what they are. Each zone is once again split into 3 acts, with Act 3 being a tiny trek to a larger badnik, and thankfully each boss has rings before them like in Chaos. The battles themselves are also much more interesting compared to the other 8-bit titles. While they aren't phenomenal, or even up to the Genesis standards, which is honestly a low bar, they all manage to be fun in their own little ways. For instance, the boss in the first zone is against this turtle badnik, but in order to hit it in the second phase, you need to use the spring curl trick. Getting the rhythm of hitting the turtle spring and the boss back to back is honestly enjoyable. The final Eggman boss is fairly easy, and while the final part can be annoying thanks to the abundance of hazards, having the ability to get your rings back makes this battle a bit of a joke if I'm being honest. It doesn't help that Sonic and Tails can just curl up into a ball while in the knockback animation, allowing them to immediately get back up and sort of weakening the impact of the hit. Special stages are back as you would expect, but this to me is where Triple Trouble begins to take a turn for the worst. The entry method this time is that Sonic or Tails, yes, he can play special stages now unlike in Chaos, need to find a hidden Chaos Emerald monitor and break it while holding 50 rings. Yeah, not a fan. This feels like it's trying to combine the Sonic 2, Genesis, and Sonic 3 methods, but I just don't like this. Why not just find a giant ring like in Sonic 3? To soften the blow, you no longer lose all of your rings upon taking a hit now, so getting surprised and smacked isn't the end of the world, but finding a monitor with this really cramped screen real estate can be tedious, especially when playing as Sonic. As for the special stages, we now have 2 different kinds. The first type is a platforming challenge like in Chaos, while the other is Sonic and Tails flying the tornado trying to collect 80 rings. Both types end with Sonic or Tails fighting Fang. The fights themselves are about the same as the main ones, but Fang is a pushover, especially early on, which I think was intentional given how inept his methods are. Let's start with the plane. It sucks. The plane is stiffer than a man after taking Viagra, the rings pop up a bit too quickly, the hitboxes are small, and the plane blocks your view of the rings more often than not. Despite that, I've never failed these even once. Still though, I just don't like these that much. Since Eggman has one of the 6 emeralds, this means you have 5 special stages to play, and thankfully only 2 of them are flying levels. I actually kind of like the standard platforming stages this time around. While the time limit can be intimidating, I find that it helps make these more engaging. The design itself is relatively solid for the first 2. As for the third and final stage, it's really dickish in places. Having the player bounce off of these spheres, and in a few cases asking players to leave the spheres intact so you have something to boost you upwards. This last level is just frustrating, and I do not like anything about going after the emeralds in this game. I think the best way they could have done this was just to have more entry points for the levels. You have 12 chances in total, but bear in mind you need 50 rings before you bust the monitors open. Doing so without the ring quota just gives you nothing. I also noticed that getting a game over and using a continue to try again will not work, so either you succeed or fail. Your reward is once again an altered ending. No super forms, in fact, no games I will cover today have them, and we don't even get a new zone like in Sonic 2 8-bit. Aspect seriously had a good idea for a reward for getting every emerald, fumbled on their first try, and just never bothered again, huh? The music is pretty dull if I'm being honest. Only one of these songs manages to catch my attention, that being the train in Sunset Park Act 3. The tune is nice and all, but compared to Sonic 1 8-bit, I'm just not bobbing my head as much. Sonic is full of bangers, but Triple Trouble just doesn't come close to the bar that other games have set. The graphics are pretty nice for the console at least. In fact, Triple Trouble is the best looking 8-bit game in my opinion. Each character has just enough personality, and the game can even get a chuckle out of me sometimes. You can tell that Aspect cared to put some TLC into this game, and I respect the hell out of that. They even try to do zone transitions like in Sonic 3, but they all just amount to Knuckles setting things on fire, or in the case of Robotnik Winter, dumping snow on our heroes. Still though, good effort. Triple Trouble is without a doubt the best traditional Sonic game aspect made for the Game Gear. It tries its best to emulate the Genesis titles, and it manages to have its own unique charm, yet the game still suffers from being on the Game Gear. The console was just not built for a character that can move at fast speeds, which is why I think Sonic 1 on the Game Gear is still the superior title. Well yeah, that game may have been a weak Sonic game, it was still a good traditional platformer in its own right. I give Sonic Triple Trouble a 6 out of 10. I know this is the same grade I gave Sonic 2 on the Master System. However, I feel like the good parts of Triple Trouble definitely outshine Sonic 2. Really, I think, unlike Sonic Chaos, you can actually play this game without going after the Chaos Emeralds and still have a fun time. Not to mention, unlike Aspect's other titles, this game has next to no cheap shots. If you ever get the chance, definitely give Triple Trouble a try. You might like it more than I do. Our next game is the final Sonic game developed by Aspect, as well as the last Sonic game on the Game Gear, Sonic Blast. Unlike Triple Trouble, this game actually did get ported to the Sega Master System. However, compared to the other 8-bit Sonic games, the way this one was ported was pretty poor. Not that it matters much, because as we'll see in just a second here, this game is certainly a game. Let's address the elephant in the room. This game is fucking ugly. Fugly if you prefer. They wanted to replicate the pre-rendered art style seen in games like the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. The reason those worked was because they were on a Super Nintendo, a 16-bit console. Even the good ending in Blast is a ripoff of the good ending from Donkey Kong Country 2. The Game Gear just isn't up to this task. I, and the general public, would have preferred a basic style akin to the previous Game Gear titles. The animations are also choppy and weird looking. Sonic has his trademark finger waggle, but here it looks like he's touching his head, like he's telling you to think twice before buying a product with his face on it. The game also doesn't really do a lot to provide us with new environments. I get that it's an 8-bit game, but some of these look like discount Sonic 3 zones, and the opening zone is literally just Green Hill Zone again. The last two zones at least look fairly original, but that's 2 out of 5, so that's not saying much. The music is also incredibly dull. In fact, this might be the worst Sonic music I've heard so far on the Game Gear. It's boring and forgettable, which is not something anyone would say about this series' OST very often. Terrible presentation aside, Blast is another Sonic game. There's very little to comment on in terms of changes made to the formula. This is the first 8-bit game to have Knuckles as a playable character, replacing Tails, but Knuckles doesn't have too much to call his own. Yeah, he can glide and climb walls, but the glide doesn't turn very well, and the wall climbing doesn't lead to any cool pathways like it would in Sonic 3 and Knuckles. In fact, Knuckles experiences the same game as Sonic, as there are no Knuckles exclusive routes like in Sonic 3. Just stick to Sonic. While he lacks the ability to climb and even perform the super peel out, he can now double jump, and without a shield this time. It's much more fun to zip around the levels with the double jump anyway. Speaking of fun, the levels aren't really that this time around. The design itself is fine, I suppose. The first 3 zones are about on par with the other good Game Gear levels. It's when the game gets to the final 2 that I begin to have problems. Blue Marine is so freaking boring. I'm not saying that because it's another water level. No, this one is straight up garbage. Through all these tubes, getting pushed around by these currents, it takes forever to get to the end. And air bubbles are scarce in this one, making for what has to be the worst underwater stage in the Classic Era. The final zone, Silver Castle, is a bit better, but I find the moving platform wheel gimmick boring, and the enemy placement to be obnoxious. Apart from those 2 bad zones, the rest are just okay. They're over within a flash, and don't have anything new to experience. The power-up monitors from Chaos and Triple? Gone. You just got your basic ring, life, and shield monitors once again. Which, by the way, the shield has been gone since the first 8-bit Sonic game. The only thing left to cover are the controls, because they do feel a bit different now. The spring curl trick is gone, the rolling jump boost glitch has been fixed, Sonic and Knuckles uncurl from a ball when dropping off a ledge now, which is this game's biggest crime, but rolling itself works fine. In fact, I'm cool with the speed. Yeah, it's a bit slow now, but because you can't see that well on a Game Gear, I think it works in this game's favor. Visibility has been a consistent problem on the Game Gear, and while Blast does have one or two blind smacks, I do find myself taking less cheap shots in this one. As I said, the biggest problem I have with the controls are that Sonic and Knuckles don't stay in the ball form when rolling off of ledges, and that it can be a bit hard to turn the characters around when skidding. Other than that, I'm fine with controls. Special stages are back, and this time around you just have to find a large ring. Thank you! No more 50 ring requirement. This time around you have 10 tries at the special stages, but with one small hiccup. You see, entering a ring in Act 1 will take you to a special stage, but your reward is an extra life. Act 2 is the exact same stage, but you get the emerald when you win. Each act only has one ring in it, so you only have one shot at the good ending in this game. The idea of messing these up once and permanently being locked out of the good ending is just stupid. And the placement on a few rings just sucks this time around. The gameplay in the special stages themselves isn't much better, I'm afraid. You run down this field collecting 50 rings. That's it. Apart from the depth perception messing with you, these are really easy. They do try putting some traps here like springs that shoot you over the rings you need to collect, but that's about all they do to challenge you. If you somehow fail, Eggman will fly in and take the prize from you, which is pretty freaking funny. They might actually be the best part of the whole game. Your reward for collecting all 5 emeralds is an altered ending plus a new final boss. Yeah, once again, this game has 5 emeralds instead of 6. But back on topic. This fight is just terrible, as it can be really hard to know where Sonic is in relation to Eggman's weak spot, and the arena itself is just so cramped. The bosses in general were average. It was a bit annoying that you could only damage the Doctor by hitting the glass on his mecha, but I'll take those over whatever the hell this razor blade egg thing is supposed to be. It does suck that Super Sonic is gone again, but he does appear on the signpost at the end, which is Super's only appearance on the Game Gear. I haven't even described the plot of this thing, and that's because I think they forgot to write one. The American manual just states that Eggman built a new fortress to do some damage, and the translated Japanese manual has Eggman fire a laser, not at Sonic, but at a Chaos Emerald near him, which causes it to shatter. I guess the latter is the plot. That's kind of what they show us in the opening, but honestly it just seems like they didn't care too much. I mean, you aren't collecting emerald shards, you're collecting emeralds, so the whole breaking emerald plot doesn't really make that much sense to me. Sonic Blast is the worst Sonic platformer on the Game Gear. While not irredeemably bad, there were some glaring issues with this one. Perhaps a little more time in the oven would have saved this game, as I think if Aspect fixed the graphics, music, and made a couple of the levels better, we could have had an average Sonic Game Gear title, if not a good one. Sonic Blast is getting a 4 out of 10. A failing grade by my standards, but not quite as bad as some other games I've looked at already. We have one final game to tackle today. Sonic 3D Blast. Yeah, not to be confused with the game we just looked at, Sonic Blast. However, Sonic Blast came out after this one. This game was developed by Traveler's Tales, and was the final Sonic game released on the Sega Genesis, and the first one on the Sega Saturn. The Genesis version was released in 1996, which was a very big year for 3D platformers, as we got both Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot. One game revolutionized an entire genre and is beloved by many people in modern times, and the other game helped drive sales of the brand new PlayStation brand, helping Sony become a major player in the video game industry. How does Sonic 3D Blast stack up? The short answer, it doesn't. The long answer, it had no chance. Sonic 3D Blast sees Eggman take his new Eggman Land plan to a place known as Flicky Island. The Flickies on this island have the ability to track down the Chaos Emeralds, so the Doctor aims to grab them all and force them to do his bidding. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles all travel to this island, only to discover that every bird has been roboticized. Sonic then makes it his mission to save every Flicky, with Tails and Knuckles help track down the Chaos Emeralds. Sonic 3D Blast is unique from the other Genesis games in that it is an overhead isometric 3D platformer. Though as we'll see soon, platformer is a bit of a strong word. Your objective this time around isn't to finish the level, but rather rescue all the Flickies scattered throughout the levels. Each badnik has a Flicky inside of it, and as you would expect, defeating it frees said Flicky. Once collected, the bird or birds will follow Sonic, and he must take them all to the big ring found inside of a segment of the level. Each act in a zone is composed of multiple segments, with each having their own set of flickies. And the game once again sports 3 acts per zone, with Act 3 strictly being a boss arena with Eggman. Sonic's abilities are pretty vanilla in this game, as all he can do is jump, roll, and spin dash. Rolling itself does not work for building speed, but it does make for a very good attack against enemies. Spin dashing is now given a dedicated button, and the way it works is surprisingly good. You have to stand still and hold a button for a bit before you launch. It's not instantaneous, but neither was the Genesis one, and given the perspective shift, I think Traveler's Tales did a great job adapting this move to this new game style. Elemental shields are back, but aren't quite as useful as before. The electric and flame shields are back, but lack their unique abilities, so Sonic can't double jump or air dash anymore. The electric shield also no longer draws in rings. In fact, for years, I thought this was the standard shield before I discovered that this one makes Sonic immune to electric attacks. The bubble shield is gone, but in its place we have the homing shield. This yellow shield will allow Sonic to perform the homing attack, which makes Sonic automatically target enemies when the player hits the jump button in midair. Yeah, this game introduced what would become one of Sonic's most important abilities. The move itself works really well, to a point to where Sonic probably should have had the move from the start. While jumping into enemies can be a bit annoying in this game, rolling sort of changes my mood on that subject, so I can't complain. What I will complain about is the game structure. This game is really boring and repetitive. Find 5 flickies, bring them to the end, rinse and repeat until you're done. My only guess as to why this was done was to pad out the length of this thing. The levels are all small and figuring out where the goal is doesn't take much time, but because you need all 5 birds to leave the level, your playtime, at minimum, triples. Not to mention the final regular stage in the game can be over in just under 2 minutes if you know where to go. This level, for whatever reason, doesn't have any flickies to collect, but I think it also proves my point. These birds are just here to give you a reason to explore and nothing else. Collecting the flickies itself isn't the hard part, bringing them to the end of the level is. You see, every time Sonic gets hit, not only will he lose his rings, but he'll lose the birds too. Normally this doesn't bother me, but the birds have their own movement patterns based on color, some of which go out of their way to avoid Sonic. This is especially a problem in a level like Volcano Valley, which is full of lava, an entire set of floor tiles that are hazardous without the flame shield. There's also the fact that the flickies follow Sonic directly behind him, and they can take a hit even if Sonic doesn't. There is a sound cue, but you may not notice it in the heat of gameplay, and the game doesn't do a great job telling you that you dropped one of these little peckers. Check this out. I got hit by a spear that was off screen, had to do a lot of hopping to recollect the flickies so that way I didn't get hit and drop them again, ran ahead thinking I had them all, only to turn back because I missed one. There's also a possibility you might get yanked away from the flicky through no fault of your own, traverse all the way back to where you lost the bird only to discover it's not there and that it completely moved into a new location. Like why? Why not just put the bird around the area where it was? This flicky concept just doesn't mesh with Sonic's core gameplay structure, and that's probably because this idea was taken from another game, Flicky. Yeah, released in arcades and on the Genesis before Sonic made his debut, the Flicky bird debuted in this title. As you can see, it's all here. Collecting birds, having to collect them again if they get hit, even the point bonus that you get from having a larger trail. Why is this Sonic game acting as a Flicky sequel when it should have just been another Sonic title? A standard 2D Sonic game with pre-rendered 3D graphics probably would have been a better move. But no, I guess they just needed to do a 3D platformer on the Genesis. I'm going to say it right now, I do not think this genre works at all. I'm sure there is a game or two that does this well, but whether I'm playing this, Super Mario RPG, or Spyro Season of Ice, I find myself missing jumps often. And that is not something I want in a platformer. At least Super Mario RPG went the role-playing game route instead of being strictly a 3D platformer. Traveler's Tales knew that the Sonic formula wasn't a great fit for the style either, which is why certain elements have been dialed down considerably. Platforming, for instance, is very infrequent, with punishment for failing jumps amounting to taking a hit or just going backwards, with there being no bottomless pits anywhere in sight. Enemies also do very little. They kind of just screw around and only damage Sonic by just bumping into him. Yes, the game would have been worse had these elements been thrown in, but I think that just proves my point. One criticism I've seen with this game is that Sonic runs at a somewhat slow pace, but like Blast on Game Gear, I think that the speed itself is fine. The Hedgehog runs fine enough here, and being faster would likely result in more hits being taken by the player. 3D Blast is just a flawed concept from the get-go. Even Sonic Team attempted this with Sonic 3 before they realized that this was a bad idea, and just made a 2D game instead, and look how well that game did. 10 out of 10. I don't score any games higher than that. What else is there to cover? Bosses are okay. Once again, you can only hit the top of the Eggmobile to damage Eggman, and the fights themselves are just dodge and wait for the right moment to strike until you win. They're short, but the fact that you can't just wail on Eggman like before means that they're padded battles. The special stages are back. In 3D Blast, to play a special stage, you must collect 50 rings and bring them to either Tails or Knuckles. What's neat about 3D Blast is that you don't need to bring all 50 to them at once. Say you have 35, and you give that to Tails. He will take them, but if you give him 15, that gets added to his total, allowing you to enter the special stage. The two aren't hard to find, they both appear once in a main act, so you have 4 chances at an emerald per zone. And the design of the game lends itself to exploration, so this is all good stuff. The special stages themselves suck though. I know I've criticized past special stages for being too hard, but these are way too easy. You run down this bridge and need to collect 50, 100, and 150 rings. If you do not have enough by the time you reach the gate, you lose. However, you will not fail these, as these are quite possibly the easiest special stages in the entire series. I mean, look at this. I have 74 more rings than what I need for the Emerald, and this is the final special stage. Your prize for going out of your way to snag these 7 fruit gushers is a new final boss. It sucks. It's not that hard, it's just really boring. Also, if this fight requires the 7 emeralds, why isn't this a supersonic boss fight? I get that he isn't in the game, but this could have been a good opportunity to put him in. Speaking of Super, let's talk about the soundtrack. 3D Blast has some of the best songs the Sega Genesis can provide. Rusty Ruin Act 1, Diamond Dust Act 2, Green Grove Act 1, the second boss music. It's all good stuff. Is it better than Sonic 3? No. I don't care for either Spring Stadium, and I think 3 and Knuckles as a package had better songs. But the music is definitely the highlight here. After playing 2 Sonic games with weak OSTs, coming back to this one was like having a really bad headache, taking aspirin, and having it work immediately. While the music is great, the visuals are also pretty good. While the pre-rendered art style isn't quite as nice as the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, we need to remember that the Sega Genesis is an older console than the SNES. This game came out about 8 years after the Genesis launched in Japan, and while 1996 had better games to offer on better hardware, Traveler's Tales pushed the Genesis as far as it could go, and the result is a technologically impressive game. Yeah, on some occasions, some hazards and flickies can blend together, but I think this game is still a technical marvel. I mean, check out this pre-rendered opening, or this cool game over screen. Yeah, this game is over. 3D Blast is just another bad Sonic game, and not really much else. Sonic 3D Blast is getting a 4.5 out of 10. Just a little under my mediocre mark. Hey, future Banditex here, just letting you know that I had to scrap my Saturn 3D Blast review. I was going to have one here, but I couldn't get my own footage, and I didn't want to borrow gameplay for an entire review, so I had to scrap it. Really though, you aren't missing much. All I will say is that I prefer the Genesis version. Anyway, time to end the video right here. Before I conclude this episode, it's time for some recommendations. Starting with Triple Trouble, the game got a 16-bit reimagining made by Noah Copeland. I myself have not played it, but I've heard some great things about it, and it looks like a great fan game. If that's not what you want, then consider the unofficial Master System port. It has some graphical bugs, but you get the same Game Gear game, warts and all, just with a bigger view distance. Sonic Blast is a similar story, but this one got an official Master System port, and the amount of graphical oddities makes this look unofficial. Considering how Sonic Blast already feels like a bootleg game, this fits right in anyway. As for 3D Blast, don't bother with the Genesis or Saturn versions. Instead, check out Sonic 3D Blast Director's Cut, made by John Burton, who actually worked on the original game. 3D Blast DX takes the many flaws present in the original Genesis title and aims to fix as many problems as possible while adding more new stuff on top of the game, including a separate mode where you have to rush to the end of the stage under a strict time limit, a password feature to save your progress, the saving feature not being present on Genesis at all, and even Supersonic. This game is still 3D Blast, and you still have the inferior special stages, but this ROM hack is such a big improvement over the original. Plus, I admire the idea of a game developer who made a bad game going back to fix said bad game to the best of their ability. It can be easy to look at a terrible game and say, oh, they didn't care, they hate you, when in reality a game can suffer in development due to many things such as a lack of finances, poor direction, small deadlines, and more. I await the day we get an improved version of Ren and Stimpy Space Cadet Adventures, but of course I'm just joking with you guys. Alright, last thing. Let's spin the wheel and see what we have next time. Alright, now for some real spin-offs. Our next subject is on games starring other characters. We have a couple of Tails games and a Knuckles game. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Banditex. I'll catch you in the next one.